In the quiet heart of Utah, 1983, a storm of horror silently unfolded, one that would echo through generations, leaving behind only pain, questions, and the cold chill of unsolved justice. A 15-year-old girl named Christine Gallegos walked out one evening and never came home. For 40 long years, her murder lay buried beneath dust, forgotten files, and fading memories. But time, as cruel as it may be, has a strange way of revealing the truth, and DNA, that invisible witness, was waiting patiently to speak. This is not just another crime story. It's a story of a young girl's stolen life, a family's never-ending grief, and a police investigation that spanned generations. As we step into this mystery, you'll feel the silence of the streets where she walked, the darkness that swallowed her whole, and the justice that finally knocked when everyone thought it never would. So stay with me till the end, because this isn't just about solving a crime. It's about witnessing how technology, faith, and time itself joined hands to expose a killer hiding in plain sight for 40 long years. It was February 14th, 1983, Valentine's Day. For most people, it was a day of love and laughter. But for Christine Gallegos, it was just another ordinary evening. The young teenager, full of life and teenage dreams, left her home in Salt Lake City, Utah, telling her mother she'd be back soon. She never returned. Her mother waited. 1 hour, then 2. The night grew colder and the phone never rang. When the morning sun rose, it carried with it a mother's worst nightmare. Christine's body was discovered near a school parking lot, brutally assaulted and murdered. She was just 15 years old. The scene was gruesome. A silence hung in the air so heavy that even the detectives felt an eerie sense of helplessness. No witnesses, no camera footage, no solid leads. Just a body and an ocean of unanswered questions. The police launched an immediate investigation, interviewing dozens of locals. But every road led to nowhere. Her family pleaded for justice, her community mourned, and the killer walked free, blending back into society as if nothing had happened. Decades passed, and Christine's name became a whisper, a tragic memory buried beneath new crimes and changing times. But destiny doesn't forget. Somewhere in a lab freezer, a few microscopic traces of evidence waited silently. No one knew then, but those tiny strands of DNA were about to become the voice Christine never had. 40 years later, science would step forward and expose the monster who thought he had buried his sins forever. If you think justice dies with time, think again. The year was 1983, and the streets of Utah buzzed with tension. Reporters rushed to the scene. Police cars lined the road, and neighbors stood in silence, unable to believe what had happened to the young girl who once smiled at them just days ago. The investigation started with urgency. Detectives knocked on doors, collected statements, and searched for any trace of Christine's final moments. But the evidence was scarce. Back then, DNA testing was still science fiction, and without eyewitnesses, the case hit a dead end. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Every promising lead collapsed under the weight of insufficient proof. A few suspects were questioned. Men from the area with criminal records, individuals who'd been seen around the school. Yet every name was cleared. Christine's mother sat in endless interviews, her face pale from grief, her eyes begging for answers that never came. The small town that once felt safe now trembled under fear and doubt. Parents began warning their daughters not to walk alone. Teachers whispered her name with sorrow. Eventually, the investigators had no choice but to shelve the case. It became one more dusty file in the police archives, a cold case stamped with the word that breaks every detective's heart: unsolved. But for Christine's family, the word unsolved didn't mean forgotten. Her mother kept her room untouched. The posters on the wall, her favorite hairbrush, her diary that ended abruptly on that fateful day. Every item was a reminder of what had been taken away, and of a promise she whispered every night before sleeping: I won't let them forget you. Years passed. Detectives retired, new officers came in, technology advanced, but Christine's story lingered like a shadow. Occasionally, new investigators opened the file again, hoping fresh eyes might see what others missed. But without DNA, without surveillance, without witnesses, justice stayed silent. Until one day, decades later, someone decided to take one more look. Not out of obligation, but out of obsession. A detective who couldn't stand the thought of a 15-year-old girl's death being lost to time reopened the file and sent the old evidence for modern DNA analysis. And that single decision, that spark of persistence, would change everything. Decades after Christine's murder, the file had gathered more dust than hope. But in 2021, a new generation of investigators decided to re-examine the case. Among them was a detective who had grown up hearing about the tragedy, someone who couldn't bear the thought that a child's killer had walked free for 40 years. When he opened the file, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The old photographs, the coroner's notes, the faded sketches of the crime scene. But what caught his eye was a small sealed evidence bag containing biological samples that had been carefully preserved. Back in the 1980s, those samples meant almost nothing. There was no way to trace them. But now, with the rise of genetic genealogy, even the smallest trace of DNA could reveal entire family trees. The detective reached out to the state crime lab and requested a full analysis. When the lab technicians placed the sample into modern sequencing machines, it was like turning on a light in a room that had been dark for decades. The screens began to flash with patterns, sequences, and possibilities, and then the match rates began to form. At first, it wasn't clear. The DNA didn't match anyone directly in the criminal database, but the genealogical cross-check began pointing toward a family line, a web of distant relatives who shared strands of genetic material with the unknown suspect. Slowly, like assembling a puzzle with invisible edges, the scientists and genealogists began narrowing it down. Piece by piece, they built a profile, a man, born in the late 1950s, who once lived in Utah. Someone who had blended back into normal life, with a clean face and a dirty secret. When the detective saw the name that surfaced, his hands trembled. It was a man who had never been on their radar. He had no prior record for violent crimes. He had lived quietly, worked ordinary jobs, raised a family, and carried on as if nothing had ever happened. The revelation hit everyone like a thunderclap. After 40 years of silence, they had finally found their suspect. The DNA, once mute, had finally spoken. And it was pointing toward a man who thought time had buried his sins forever. But before they could confront him, investigators needed to be absolutely certain. They followed him discreetly, watching his every move, waiting for the perfect moment to collect a new DNA sample. Something current, something undeniable. And when that sample was tested, there was no doubt left. The man's name was Donald Cox, a name that sounded ordinary, harmless even, like the kind of person you'd never suspect of something so monstrous. For years he had lived an unremarkable life, working steady jobs, paying taxes, and blending seamlessly into society. He wasn't on any watch list, wasn't hiding, and had no known connection to Christine or her family. To everyone around him, he was just another face in the crowd. But behind that face lay decades of silence, guilt, and a secret he thought would never surface again. When investigators quietly began to follow him, they were struck by how normal his life appeared. He lived alone, kept to himself, and had few visitors. Detectives collected a discarded item, a cup, a tissue, from his trash to test for DNA. And when the results came back, the confirmation hit like a lightning strike. The genetic profile matched perfectly with the DNA found on Christine Gallegos' body in 1983. The odds of error were astronomically low. After 40 years, the monster had a name, but there was a cruel twist. Just when the detectives were preparing the arrest warrant, they received devastating news. Donald Cox had died. He passed away in 2021, just months before the DNA link was confirmed. For investigators who had poured their hearts into reopening the case, it felt like justice had arrived too late. The man who took Christine's life had slipped away from earthly judgment, leaving behind only the cold comfort of scientific truth. Still, the discovery brought something precious to the surface: closure. For Christine's family, the revelation tore open old wounds, yet stitched together a new kind of peace. After 40 years of not knowing, they finally had a name, a face, and an answer. Her mother, now aged and fragile, said through tears, "At least I know who he was. At least now my baby's story has an ending." The detectives stood quietly that day, realizing that justice doesn't always wear handcuffs or deliver trials. Sometimes justice arrives as a whisper, the truth unveiled just in time to free the living from decades of torment. But the question lingered: how could a man hide such darkness for so long? What kind of life does someone lead after taking another's? And how many more secrets did he take to his grave? The answers buried with him left behind a haunting silence. After his name was revealed, detectives began digging deep into the life of Donald Cox, hoping to understand the monster behind the mask. Born in the late 1950s, Cox grew up in Utah, quiet, unremarkable, and almost invisible to those around him. He had no major criminal record, no history of violence, and no one who ever suspected him of being capable of such brutality. Friends described him as ordinary, a man who kept to himself. But behind that ordinariness was a chilling calm, the kind only a person who had buried a dark secret could maintain. Investigators learned that after Christine's murder, Cox never left Utah. He stayed in the same region, working low-profile jobs, attending local events, and even interacting with families who had no idea that a murderer was walking among them. Every Valentine's Day, the same date Christine was killed, passed like any other for him. No guilt on display, no remorse ever revealed. It was as if he had compartmentalized his crime, buried it so deep that even he no longer flinched at the memory. Forensic psychologists who reviewed the case later said Cox fit the pattern of a controlled predator, someone who could commit a violent act, then return to normal life as if it never happened. That ability to blend, to erase emotion, made him nearly impossible to catch. He had likely convinced himself that time had erased his footprints, that the world had moved on and Christine's story had faded into silence. But the truth never forgets, and DNA never lies. Neighbors who learned of his connection to the murder were stunned. One woman recalled how he used to greet everyone with a polite nod, mow his lawn every weekend, and never cause trouble. "He didn't look evil," she said. "That's what scares me most." The words carried the weight of an entire community's shock. How evil can live next door and smile like everyone else? For investigators, each new detail about his life deepened the mystery. There were no other reported assaults, no trail of violence, no open signs of aggression. It was as if Christine had been a single, horrifying moment in an otherwise ordinary existence, and that made the case even more haunting, because it reminded everyone that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who look the most human. Even in death, Donald Cox left behind no confession, no explanation, no letter of remorse. Just silence. And that silence now belonged to Christine's family, the silence they had carried for 40 years, now transformed into a truth they never thought they'd see. Christine Gallegos was more than a victim. She was a bright, curious, and vibrant teenager, whose laughter filled every room she entered. Friends recall her as someone who dreamed big despite her young age, with plans for high school, college, and maybe even traveling beyond Utah. She loved music, had a talent for art, and carried a diary where she recorded her thoughts, secrets, and hopes for the future. Every page reflected the heart of a young girl full of life, a life that was cut brutally short. Her disappearance shook the community. Schools held vigils, neighbors put up posters, and her family organized search parties. People who didn't even know Christine felt the pain of her absence. For her parents, every day was a torment of unanswered questions: where she had gone, who had taken her, and why anyone could commit such a heinous act. Her mother often said that she felt Christine's presence in every corner of the home, a haunting reminder of the child she lost and the justice that seemed forever out of reach. Even 40 years later, Christine's story resonates with anyone who has lost a loved one to violence. Her name became a symbol of innocence stolen and the consequences of unchecked evil. Teachers who had once watched her in class remembered her curiosity, her intelligence, and her quiet kindness. Friends recalled small gestures, how she always offered a smile, how she stood up for classmates, and how she imagined a world full of possibility. Christine's legacy is more than just a cold case file. It is the memory of a life that deserved more than tragedy. Her parents, despite the crushing weight of grief, became advocates for other victims' families, ensuring that Christine's story would never be forgotten. They attended community meetings, spoke on local news, and encouraged law enforcement to keep cold cases active, a tireless dedication born from love and loss. Her room, frozen in time, told the story of a girl who had barely begun to live. Posters of pop stars adorned the walls, sketchbooks filled with drawings, and her diary lay untouched, a silent witness to a life interrupted. Visitors to the house often left in tears, overwhelmed by the stark contrast between her youthful vibrancy and the darkness that ended her life. Christine Gallegos' story reminds us that victims are never just statistics. They are people, full of hopes, dreams, and laughter, lives that demand remembrance and justice. The truth, though delayed, gave her family the answer they had longed for, the name of her killer. And while nothing could bring Christine back, finally knowing who had taken her provided a measure of closure, a chance to honor her memory, and to remind the world that no crime, no matter how long ago, should ever be forgotten. When news broke that Donald Cox had been identified as Christine Gallegos' killer after 40 years, the story captured national headlines. Social media buzzed with disbelief and horror. People couldn't comprehend how a man could live decades without anyone suspecting a thing. Journalists and true crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, from the original 1983 investigation to the breakthrough DNA testing that finally exposed the truth. The case became a symbol of both the persistence of law, enforcement, and the power of modern technology. In solving cold cases, local news stations revisited the tragedy with emotional interviews from Christine's family. Her mother, still grieving but now armed with answers, spoke softly yet firmly about her daughter's life and legacy. "It's been 40 years of living in a nightmare," she said. "Finally knowing who took Christine gives us a measure of peace, even if justice can't reach him now." Her words struck a chord across the nation, drawing attention to countless other cold cases that remained unresolved. The revelation also sparked discussions about the criminal justice system and forensic advancements. Experts emphasize that while justice may have been delayed, it was never truly denied. Cold case units nationwide highlighted Christine's case as an example of perseverance, urging families to keep hope alive and law enforcement to revisit unsolved crimes. Documentaries, podcasts, and news segments began analyzing the case, examining the impact of DNA genealogy, and exploring the ethical implications of solving decades-old murders. Meanwhile, the community in Salt Lake City was shaken. People who had lived alongside Cox for years reflected on the frightening reality that someone capable of such violence could appear so ordinary. Parents spoke of renewed fears for their children and the importance of vigilance, while others expressed admiration for the detectives who refused to give up. Local forums and online discussions filled with theories, memories, and collective mourning, uniting the community in a shared, decades-long grief now partially assuaged by truth. For Christine's surviving siblings and relatives, the public attention brought a complicated mixture of emotions. On one hand, the acknowledgement of her story validated their years of pain. On the other, reliving the case through news coverage reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Yet amidst the sorrow there was pride, Pride that Christine's life mattered, that her story had inspired improvements in cold case investigations, and that her name would never again be forgotten. As the media spotlight highlighted the extraordinary role of DNA genealogy, it also raised awareness of technological evolution in criminal investigations. What once seemed impossible, identifying a killer after 40 years, had become reality. Christine's case stood as both a warning and a beacon. Justice can be delayed, but it cannot be denied. And through this revelation, the world remembered Christine Gallegos not just as a victim, but as a girl whose story helped change the landscape of crime-solving forever. For Christine's family, the revelation of Donald Cox as her killer brought a complicated mix of grief, relief, and lingering sorrow. 40 years of unanswered questions had left invisible scars, sleepless nights, tearful anniversaries, and a persistent ache that refused to fade. Yet knowing who was responsible allowed them to finally place a name on the void that had haunted them for decades. It was not justice in the courtroom sense, but it was an acknowledgement of the truth that Christine deserved. The community of Salt Lake City, once paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, began reflecting on the fragility of trust and safety. Neighbors shared stories of Christine, her youthful innocence, and the shock of discovering the predator had lived among them. Vigils and memorials were organized, not only to honor Christine's memory but also to encourage conversations about child safety, the importance of vigilance, and the value of supporting families affected by violent crime. In these gatherings, grief turned into action. Parents, teachers, and students worked together to ensure such a tragedy would never be forgotten. Local authorities used the case as an educational example, teaching young detectives how persistence and modern technology could solve even decades-old crimes. Cold case units around Utah and across the country cited Christine's murder as proof that investigations never truly expire. Her story became a symbol of hope for families still searching for answers, proving that even in the darkest corners, justice can find a way. Christine's siblings spoke openly about their journey, the emotional toll of waiting, the frustration of unanswered calls, and the profound relief that came with closure. "We finally know," one sibling said, voice trembling. "And even though it doesn't bring her back, it brings a measure of peace. We can now remember her for the beautiful life she lived, not just the tragedy she endured." The statement resonated with families everywhere who struggle with unresolved losses, reminding them that truth, no matter how delayed, has transformative power. The emotional reckoning extended beyond grief. It was about understanding the fragility of life, the consequences of human evil, and the resilience of the human spirit. Christine's story challenged the community to confront uncomfortable truths, that evil can wear the face of normalcy, that innocence can be stolen, and that healing is a journey, not a destination. It emphasized the importance of collective memory, storytelling, and advocacy to ensure victims are never forgotten. Through memorials, interviews, and personal reflections, Christine Gallegos became more than a name in a cold case file. She became a beacon of perseverance, a reminder that even the smallest voice can echo across decades, demanding justice and recognition. Her family, though forever changed by loss, embraced the truth and vowed to honor her life by sharing her story, one that spoke of love, innocence, tragedy, and finally, the quiet triumph of truth. Christine Gallegos' case is a testament to the power of modern forensic science. In 1983, investigators were limited by the technology of the era. No DNA profiling, no genetic genealogy, no advanced databases to trace minute evidence. Yet the preserved biological samples from her murder became silent witnesses, waiting for a time when technology could finally speak. 40 years later, the evolution of forensic science transformed those tiny, overlooked traces into an irrefutable narrative, exposing a killer who had evaded justice for decades. DNA genealogy became the cornerstone of the breakthrough. By connecting fragments of DNA to distant relatives and mapping family trees, Forensic scientists narrowed the search to a single suspect, Donald Cox. This method, once considered impossible, has revolutionized criminal investigations, solving cases that had been considered permanently cold. Christine's story illustrates that even the most meticulous killers cannot outrun science, and that truth has a remarkable way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it is buried. The case also sparked a broader discussion in law enforcement circles. Departments across the country began reviewing unsolved crimes, re-examining preserved evidence, and employing new DNA techniques to identify suspects long forgotten by time. Christine's story became a model for training programs, emphasizing persistence, attention to detail, and the importance of technological innovation in criminal investigations. It showed that patience combined with science can bring closure where human memory and traditional methods failed. Moreover, Christine's case inspired policy changes. Lawmakers and crime advocates pushed for better evidence preservation protocols, longer retention of biological samples, and the expansion of cold case units. The recognition that evidence, however small, can be pivotal decades later, changed the way investigators approached unsolved crimes nationwide. Families of victims began lobbying for similar re-examinations, empowered by the knowledge that justice could eventually prevail. For the public, the story was a revelation. It demonstrated that while time may allow pain to fester, it does not erase the truth. Christine's murder, once a nameless tragedy, now served as a symbol of hope and accountability. It reminded everyone that innovation, perseverance, and courage can triumph over evil, even if it takes 40 years. Finally, Christine's case underscored a profound lesson. Killers may hide, memories may fade, but evidence endures. And when it finally speaks, the voices of the victims, once silent, are finally heard, reverberating through time to demand justice, remembrance, and respect. The identification of Donald Cox as Christine Gallegos' killer marked a bittersweet moment in the story of a young life stolen too soon. Justice, in the traditional sense, could not be served. The killer had passed away before he could face trial. Yet for Christine's family, there was a profound sense of closure. The mystery that had haunted them for 4 decades finally had an answer, and her memory could finally be honored with the truth known. Community members and law enforcement reflected on the decades-long investigation, recognizing the tireless dedication of detectives who refused to abandon the case. Their commitment, combined with cutting-edge DNA technology, proved that even crimes buried in time could be uncovered. Christine's story became a beacon, inspiring investigators, forensic scientists, and families of victims to persist, to believe that no case is ever truly hopeless. For Christine's loved ones, healing began slowly. While grief remains eternal, they embraced the knowledge that the darkness surrounding her death had been illuminated. Her parents, siblings, and friends could now tell her story fully, not only of tragedy but also of perseverance, resilience, and the power of truth. The community held vigils, memorials, and commemorations, turning their collective mourning into a celebration of Christine's life and spirit. The case also left a legacy beyond Utah. Cold case units across the country cited Christine's murder as a turning point, highlighting how DNA genealogy and modern forensic science can rewrite history. Lawmakers, crime advocates, and investigators used her story to advocate for policies ensuring evidence preservation, proper training, and continued investment in technology, ensuring that other victims would not be forgotten or ignored. Christine's story, though marked by tragedy, became a symbol of hope. It showed that while evil may hide behind ordinary faces, and while time may seem to shield the guilty, truth always has a way of emerging. Her life, dreams, and potential were stolen, but her memory continues to inspire justice and vigilance, reminding society that every victim deserves to be remembered and every crime deserves to be solved. As the story closes, one thought lingers. Justice may be delayed, but the voices of the innocent are never silenced. Christine Gallegos' light, though extinguished far too soon, now shines brighter than ever, a testament to resilience, technology, and the enduring human desire for truth. And while the killer may rest forever in anonymity, Christine's story will continue to echo, inspiring courage, remembrance, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Thank you for joining us as we unraveled the haunting story of Christine Gallegos. Her life was stolen, but her memory will never be forgotten. This case reminds us that truth can emerge even after decades, that persistence and technology can illuminate the darkest mysteries, and that every victim deserves justice, however delayed. If Christine's story touched you, or if you believe in giving a voice to the voiceless, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this story, and hit the notification bell. By doing so, you help keep her memory alive and support awareness for other cold cases waiting for justice. And remember, some truths are hidden for years, but they always have a way of coming to light. What would you do if a mystery from decades ago suddenly revealed its secrets? Share your thoughts below.